That is really great. I'm really glad to see all of you. Let me see. I gotta let one more person in here. Okay. All right. Well, wow. Welcome.
Thomas in here too. Hello.
Welcome again. I'm really glad to see all of you. And you'll read my
Glad to see you.
thank you. You'll read my Shabbat message in a few hours. It'll come out. I wrote it yesterday, and you'll know better then than now what I mean when I wish you all a happy new year. Okay, so
we miss you, Rabbi. We miss you.
well, I miss all of you, but this is in some ways it's way better than nothing, and in some ways it's better than schlepping to Century City. So
For real.
could be worse. But we'll get back there someday. I just don't know when. Carrie and Ray, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay. All right. So, Vae'ra, we're not going to look at the entire Torah portion, and we're not going to look at it at all for the first few minutes. My plan today, if possible, is we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about Moses in general, because we're sort of at the beginning of the book. Just we started it last week. And I would just want to make some general observations about Moses, why Moses is such an important character, and why Moses is not an important character. And I'll explain that. And then we're going to jump right to the plagues. We're just going to go right to, the third act in this Parsha, and go right to the plagues and talk a little bit about the plagues and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And if we have time after that, since it's the end of the year in a way, Gregorian anyway, if we have time, we'll just open it up for any general questions, thoughts, comments that people want to share since we're ending the year. But let me start before
Where
we.
can I look?
Well, nowhere yet. Nowhere yet, Bob.
Okay.
But when it's time, I think we're going to go to, when we get to the text, it'll be Exodus chapter 7, verse 14. So if you have a phone with you or a second device, or you actually have a real book in front of you, when we get to the text, we're going to get to the section that is Exodus chapter 7, and we'll start with verse 14. But we're not going to get there yet. First, I want to make a few general observations about this character of Moses and what Moses does and does not represent. And, let's just start with the notion that Moses is and I've mentioned this before, a fairly common leadership type or motif in folk literature, in folklore. This is a very common and powerful archetype that exists today of a person born into the peasant class or the oppressed class, somehow, miraculously or otherwise, is elevated and raised among the ruling class, and then returns to liberate the oppressed, the underclass, where he or she is really from, in the deepest meaning of that phrase. So in that sense, Moses is fairly typical. And this is a story you hear to this very day. I just was watching the news this morning about a retired NFL player who came up in very difficult circumstances, became very successful in the NFL, and now runs a foundation to help get ex-convicts jobs and expunge their criminal records. This morning on the news was an example of this paradigm, right? Down, up, back down, volitionally back down, okay? I was watching, they're rerunning Anthony Bourdain's series on CNN now, which in my opinion is fantastic. And I was watching him have a beer in Southeast Asia with Obama in Vietnam. And Obama started talking about how he was really very familiar with these kinds of environments because he was, raised without a father in Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there it was, right? Down, up, back down. So this is very common, and this is Moses, which is one of the reasons we're not sure such a person actually existed. There's no historical record in any Egyptian literature of some kind of massive enslavement and exodus. And you would think if 600,000 people got up and walked out of Egypt one day, it probably would have been recorded somewhere, but it's not. And then there are some details of Moses's life that indicate that maybe this was a real story. He's married to a Midianite woman, for example, which would not have fit the paradigm. His sort of personal familial details do paint a picture of an actual person in a way. So we don't really know, but I don't know of a single scholar who actually believes the Exodus took place as described in the Torah. We're dealing with myth and archetype here. And I understand the heresy of what I just said from a more orthodox perspective. And this, even saying that the Exodus didn't happen, almost cost my friend David Wolpe his job in a conservative congregation. So I understand how that might sound, but really from any kind of academic perspective, we're dealing here with a story that asks us to move far beyond history, to look at the eternal truths of this story. Now, the important thing about Moses. Let's talk about the end of Moses's life, which I think tells us so much about what his role is in the larger picture of what it means to be a Jew and what Judaism means. So most of us know that Moses leads the Israelites for 40 years, gets to the edge of the promised land, and is told by God, you can see it, but you're not going in. And you need to ordain Joshua, who will lead the people into the promised land, capital P, capital L. Not a word of complaint from Moses. And then he goes up on Mount Nebo and he dies. And the Midrash says he dies with a kiss from God, which is a beautiful way of thinking about death generally, by the way, that it's a kiss from God. And again, I know we've talked about this before. That's all the detail we get. We're not told exactly where Moses is buried, who's there. Is it an Abraham-like scene, with his estranged sons there to bury, Sarah, etc.? No, there's no burial scene. There's no cave that's mentioned. There's no shrine of any kind or altar of any kind. All we know is he dies on this mountain, and his grave is intentionally unmarked. And so at the end of this, the greatest of all prophets' lives, he is diminished, kind of canceled in a way. Not for I would say for religious reasons more than political reasons, but I think canceled is kind of an interesting way to think about it. Not because he's done anything wrong, but because the tradition and the goal is to de-emphasize the importance of the individual, of the individual's religious pursuit. Now, this is just Steve Leder talking, and we can talk about this, and I want to talk about this, but this is my view, that the critical moment here, when Moses dies, in this nondescript way is the de-emphasizing of the man God. This is a differentiation from a person like Jesus, for example. This is why it's called Judaism and not Mosesism. And that's something that the tradition would not abide. And so, in a sense, the law replaces the individual. Torah replaces Moses as the central force in Judaism. It's the law, not the person. And the law, and I'm generalizing here, okay, because there are exceptions to what I'm saying. There are places in Judaism where the individual is of tantamount importance, right? Of paramount importance, sorry. If we save a life, it's as if we save the entire world. So there are exceptions, but generally speaking, Judaism moves after Moses' death from being a religion focused on the narrative, on the human story of this people and its leaders, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. We move from that to the de-emphasis, a lack of emphasis on the individual and emphasis on the law. Most of the Torah is about the law, not about individuals and their stories. The law subordinates the individual. And Judaism, these laws are mostly about protecting and enabling society to flourish, not about an individual's spirituality. Now that's a big statement about Judaism, that Judaism is essentially constructed for the sake of society, not the sake of an individual's spirituality. Obviously, Judaism is it absorbs the larger ethos in which it has survived. And so there are times when Jews emphasize the individual spiritual nature of certain aspects of Judaism, right? Jews were affected by the 60s in America. Jews were affected by the Beatles going to India. Jews, it's not that we don't absorb some of the emphases of the larger ethos, but fundamentally speaking, Judaism is about law, not individuals, and the law is about society and not individual spirituality. And this is a constant tension in Judaism because the larger ethos often is about the spirituality of the individual. Just think about the idea of a minyan. You don't pray alone as a Jew. You gotta have 9 other Jews there with you, which also has a profound societal effect of protecting and nurturing Jewish society. And now, before we get too down about this, like, oh, that's terrible, what about the individual? I think it's fair to say that the worldview of the rabbis was that if society would live by these rules, it would create a kind of heaven on earth. I think this is why the Talmud says if everyone would celebrate one Shabbat simultaneously, the world to come would arrive, the Messiah would arrive, right? That ultimately this is the path to every individual feeling at peace and fulfilled. But it's done by considering society and how we behave as a society rather than our own individual separate journey. And this is why I think there's so many Jews who are interested in Buddhism and other kinds of things, because fundamentally Judaism is not about that. Although many of us find deep personal meaning in it, I think we see here in the character of Moses and the way in which the law subordinates him. I mean, for example, his name isn't even in the Passover Haggadah. Think about that for a minute. The rabbis wrote him out of the Haggadah. They wrote him out, again, to de-emphasize. So that's my rambling about Moses and the general religious construct of Judaism. Let's take any questions or comments, and then we're going to start talking about the plagues. Wendy, go ahead and unmute.
Hi.
Hi.
Steve, I wanted to let you know I'm not in Northern California anymore. I moved to Massachusetts.
Oh, even further away from us, Wendy.
Further away, yes.
Ay.
So I think what you said is really
Oh,
fascinating.
no.
Wait. Everybody mute except Wendy. Thank you.
And I don't know if what I'm about to say about this even came from a prior Torah study, but there's a very sort of straightforward, simple reason why the Old Testament God, who we know, is a jealous God. For expediency's sake, Moses had to be the leader. All of the Jews who were with him had to unquestionably follow him. So he was sort of like he set himself up almost as a god, and it was expedient so that they could get through. What happens at the end, he's done his job. He got them where he needed to go, and he needs to be exactly what you said, sort of canceled, because he can no longer have that role with the people. That role has to go back to God.
Yeah, well, not only Moses cannot, no individual can have that role. And the only thing I would push back on a little, Wendy, is this idea that all these Jews obediently followed Moses. It's 40 years of bickering and complaining and rebellion, the golden calf, Korach, wish we had died in Egypt. It would be better than being free out. I mean, it was not like they weren't a subservient bunch. I mean, they were Jews after all. So,
Right.
it was a struggle. But you're spot on, I think, in the sense that no individual could or should represent God in that way. Only God is God. I've said many times when the Torah quotes God saying, "I am God," or "I am the Lord thy God," etc., it is simultaneously saying, "And you are not," and no human is, right?
Yeah.
So good. Okay, stay warm in Boston. Jeez. Okay, Carol, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. What you are saying, I'm very comfortable with, and it's something that I have believed as a principle. Can you help explain how highly identified Jews have portraits of the Rebbe if they're part of the Lubavitcher sect? It makes me extremely uncomfortable as a Jew to see that idolatry of a man.
Yeah, I can't, you're not alone in your discomfort. And a lot of us are uncomfortable with that. I think the Rebbe, although, by the way, Schneerson was an amazing scholar and teacher, utterly amazing. And I think he would have been the first to agree with what I'm saying about the primacy of God over any human being. But his disciples, for their own reasons, did in a way deify him, although I'm sure they would claim not to. But you're right, there are these countervailing tendencies. There's no question about it, and there have been many false messiahs in Judaism. Yeah, you're right. I can't listen to ask me to be an apologist for the Lubavitchers is not the right call here. I think you're right. It's
Uncomfortable.
out of line. I think it's out of line. Yep. Now let's see. I have Ray, then Gay, and then Susan. Okay, Ray, Gay,
Yes.
and Susan. Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah. With the previous strong characters, particularly Isaac and Jacob and Joseph,
Yeah.
we've seen a strong connection between them and their fathers.
Just raise your hand.
And in focusing on the acquisition of these moral values, thinking that Isaac acquired the values from Abraham and Jacob from Isaac and Joseph from Jacob. But yet Moses comes onto the scene here, and there's scant mention of his father, Amram, and he doesn't even live with his people. Yet he's acquired these mensch-like values. Where do they come from? He's living with the Pharaoh.
Yeah, well, okay. First of all, none of the patriarchs, matriarchs, etc., and I would add Joseph to that, in Breshit, deliver the kind of legal corpus, of literature, the kind of law that Moses later in the book of Exodus spends the rest of his life delivering. So I think when you say they lived these values, they lived a few of them, monotheism being one of them, but they delivered nothing like what Moses delivered in terms of actual law. And so I think that's a big differentiator. And you're right about his personal story. It's strange. It's really his mother who is pulling the strings in a lot of ways. By the way, you could argue that this is also true for Isaac and for Jacob. So, the women really end up kind of steering the destiny of these children. So in that way, it's similar. I think Isaac is a relatively, frankly, minor figure in the lives of his children, maybe because he was so traumatized by his own father. And Moses, interestingly enough, married, as I said, this Midianite woman, and it seems like the best man in his life is his father-in-law, who's a Midianite priest, who gives him, frankly, the best man-to-man advice in the Torah, I think. So you're right. He is different. He is definitely different, and more of an archetype. But I would say that he is different in a I don't know how to quite put this, in a Jewish way, in the sense that he is really the prophet of the law. Those 613 mitzvot, which we know is kind of a myth in and of itself, are from him. They're not from Abraham, they're not from Isaac, and they're not from Jacob, and they're not from Joseph, and they're not from Ephraim, and they're not from Manasseh. So I think that's an important distinction. But yeah, it's interesting. There's very little mention of his father and not a whole lot of his mother later on. So yes, I'm with you. Now, I think it was Sue Ehrlich and then Gay. Or was it Gay and Sue? I think it was Gay. Ray, Gay, and Sue. I did that so I would remember it. Go ahead, Gay.
Am I there? So I was just wondering if it's possible that Moses was actually a very sort of humble guy, and if he himself took him out of the final stages because he wanted to ensure that he wouldn't be put on a pedestal and revered or made into a god.
He's called, in fact, he's called in the Torah the humblest of human beings. So yes.
Oh.
Yes, humility is definitely an aspect of Moses and why he was chosen. And he himself, when God says go to the Pharaoh, he says, I have a speech impediment. Can't you send someone else? And he needs his brother, Aaron, to in a sense, speak for him. And he's old, right? These guys are in their 80s when they get called in off the bench. So yeah, there is an aspect of humility baked into his persona and his character, if we can call it a character. And I think, yes, he isn't, he takes his shoes off. He is humble. Very different than Joseph, for example, who we know evidences a lot of arrogance early in his life. And we don't see that from Moses. So he's kind of pure in that way. But did he Did he do this intentionally? We have no way of knowing. We have no record of him saying, "Hey, please God, don't let me into the promised land and don't tell anyone where I'm buried." And there's no evidence of that. I think Moses is a character and humility is a part of it, but I think he was also consciously diminished by the tradition. And certainly when we talk about things like the Haggadah, for example, wasn't Moses's decision to be written out of the Haggadah. Even if Moses was an historical figure, it's 1,000 years later that we even get to what anything resembling a Passover Seder. So I don't think it was conscious on his part, but conscious on the part of the creators of the Moses reality. Sue Ehrlich, where are you? There you are. Hi, Sue.
Susan.
Susan, sorry.
Susan, because that's how
Yeah.
I think it was a really interesting question that was raised about where did he get his ethics from? And I kind of look at Exodus as a disjunction written by somebody else than the Genesis, because there's such an abrupt break. The Pharaoh didn't know the Jewish people.
That's right.
So I see it as if not completely different, I mean, very different, although it's always mentioned the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So
Yes.
How did he know it was their fathers?
Yes.
And maybe it was through his mother.
Well, what I think really about that, Susan, is that you have here an attempt to meld multiple narratives into one in order to bring a people together, right? So that everyone's story is a part of the meta story and feels a part of it, right? And so, I think that's a lot of the political agenda here and societal agenda is to weave together and connect these various narrative traditions into one.
There was one other thing I just wanted to say parenthetically. I would suggest books on the Rebbe, Joseph Toulouse.
Yeah.
An excellent book. And
It is.
Aiden Steinsaltz has another one. Best is, I think, Toulouse. But if anything, he didn't want to be a Messiah. And he was very learned, very intelligent, and he helped a lot of people. And I think we need.
I agree, and I think it was sort of his disciples in order. I'm going to put this crassly to keep the business going. Made something of him. Toulouse's father was his accountant, and it's such a great insight into the whole thing. And I also, now this is just my theory, okay, because I wrote my rabbinical thesis on Einstein. Who became Einstein not only because of his own brilliance, but because he showed up at a certain time in the world. Heroes are both born and made. I think the photogenic nature of the Rebbe has a lot to do with his image being so iconic. That's just a theory. Einstein, I'm 100% sure that's the case. The camera loved him. And during an age when that first became important. So I think that might be a part of it too. Like he was a good looking rabbi, if you know what I mean. I mean, he played the part because he was the part and it wasn't playing. I mean, that was who he was, but I agree with you. Yes. And in any case, I want to respond to your question, Susan, about like, where did Moses get his ethics? If you just take the narrative at face value, from God. He goes up that mountain and he comes down with Judaism. And at that point, all human beings become less important than the law and the text. Now, was Moses a vehicle for that as a character? Yes. But if you just take the narrative at its face value, they came from God. Okay, and Gay, where are you? We got Gay, we got Susan, we got Ray. Okay. Anyone else before we jump into the plagues?
May I speak, Rabbi?
Yeah, I don't know who that is, but yeah,
That's
go ahead.
Miss Jones, don't I?
Yes,
I
go ahead.
just want to say that you are so intelligent. Oh my gosh.
Okay, let me
There's
record
a
that.
lot- Okay, I have not, I'm learning. I have so much to learn. But this about society coming together, society looks at, and we're supposed to be subordinate. I really think that humility, thank you for pointing that out with Moses. That's what you are, and that's what Wilshire
Okay.
Boulevard Temple, wait a minute, I'm gonna say this. You are one of the most humblest, generous, kind people, and we are so lucky to have you. That's all I'm gonna say.
Thank you very much. Please call my mother. She still thinks I should be running Leader Brothers Scrap Iron and Metal. Okay, I see Miriam, go ahead, and then we'll go from there. There are two more, and then I really want to move on to the plagues. So it's Miriam, and who else has their hand raised?
Barry.
Who?
Rabbi, Rabbi,
Okay, go ahead, Miriam.
when you mentioned that we don't have proof that Moses actually ever lived, we simply don't have proof, nor do we have proof that the slaves were in Egypt, nor do we have proof of all those years that led up to Passover, to Pesach, and to the Exodus.
Right.
And then Rabbi Wolpe said, and we just listened, sort of accepted. If you can say one sentence to this so that people will feel comfortable with it and they'll still have their Passover meal, and some of the reactions to Rabbi Wolpe's statement in maybe 5 years ago or so, when he said, we have no proof that there was slavery and that there was an Exodus. This was so shocking that it reverberated in New York, where literally my relatives called me and asked me what he meant by that. And so if you would address that one sentence, because it's an easy thing to answer, that we can continue with our traditions. We can continue
Miriam,
with
look,
without
we've talked about this before. I think you have to parse the difference between a fact and a truth. Whether or not this narrative is factual, to me, is irrelevant. I'm interested in its truths. That society is more important than the individual. That law should trump a personality cult. That Mitzrayim means a narrow, constricted place, and you can only become free by walking through that narrow, frightening place. That ultimately, if you oppress, you become oppressed, which is Pharaoh, of course. That there's so many important truths in this narrative. I find the facts to be irrelevant. But when this happened to David, he called me and asked me to write a defense in the Jewish Journal, which I happily did. And I started it by saying, this is no more surprising than saying the world isn't flat. From an historical perspective, but it's surprising if you've never thought deeply about the Torah. So, to me, the truth versus fact way of seeing this is the best way to help people understand what Torah is about. And that doesn't mean there are no facts in the Torah. It just means that the Torah is not a history book. Okay, if it's okay,
Can I add one little thing?
Who is that?
Barry.
Yeah, go ahead, Barry.
I was thinking of the comparison to a modern day Moses in our Martin Luther King, who came from humble beginnings and rose to lead the world, and then was not allowed to get to the promised land.
Well, he even referenced it in his speech, right? And
I might not get there with you.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, he was clearly identifying himself with Moses and the narrative. I may not get there with you, but I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you. I think he knew that his life was in danger. I'm not a Martin Luther King expert or scholar, but he clearly, Barry, in that speech, was identifying
with Moses,
with the truth of the Moses story.
Oh, sorry.
Absolutely. Okay, one more. Dick, go ahead.
At while you're on the pulpit, to your right is the last segment of the Torah.
That's right.
And part of it says, never again would there be a prophet like Moses.
Same.
If with a Christian or a Muslim, how do you justify when they say, what are you talking about with regard to Jesus or Muhammad?
I don't need to justify it. It's just,
How do you deal with their complaining then?
What?
How would you deal with their complaint that you're minimizing our prophets?
No, there was never another prophet it's no different than saying there was never another prophet like Jesus. I mean, they're each unique in their own ways. And I don't, it's like, I think it's about the uniqueness of traditions and individuals. And I wouldn't defend it at all. I would just say, yeah, and there's never another one like Jesus and never another one like Muhammad and never another one like Gandhi. Okay. I wouldn't get too defensive about that. Okay. That's how long I've been married. I just say, you're right.
May I just quickly say one thing? What you said about society and everybody coming together, everybody has a different religion, their different traditions, everything. But music and sports brings us all together, and let's just try to do that and bring peace and love, because that's the only answer.
Amen. All right. Now I want to move. Let's move forward. Okay. Let's now start looking at the plagues. And I'm going to move quickly, but let's go to 7:14.
Okay.
Okay. And I'm going to read quickly, if you don't mind. And let me just give everyone a second to get there. Exodus 7:14. And the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he's coming out to the water, and station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile, taking with you the rod that turned into a snake. And say to him, the Lord, the God of Hebrews, sent me to say to you, let my people go, that they may worship me in the wilderness, but you've paid no heed until now. Thus says the Lord, by this shall you know I am the Lord. Shall I strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, or it will be turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile will die, the Nile will stink, etc., etc. And off we go into the plagues. Okay? And I just now want to talk a little bit about Pharaoh's response to the plagues and some of the thinking about the first few plagues through the minds and eyes of the rabbi. But I think the most important and problematic, wait, Sukasa, do you have your hand up, Sue? Where are you? Go ahead, unmute.
Do we know that there were these plagues in Egypt at this time? Is there any historical evidence?
No, I mean, people have tried. People have said, well, the Nile turning to blood must have been an algae bloom that killed all the fish, and then the frogs escaped from the Nile to get away from the algae bloom. I mean, there are two ways to scratch an itch, like this or like this. And I think these explanations are kind of scratching the itch like that. The answer is no. Now, again, it's not that there are never facts in the Torah. Did locusts swarm across the land sometimes? Yeah, I lived in Cincinnati. I was ordained in 1987, was the 17th year of the cicadas. And I'm telling you, we were walking with umbrellas in downtown Cincinnati to keep the cicadas from, just falling down on us. So, yeah, I mean, there are these things happen in nature, some of them. Do cattle get disease? Do people get boils? Yeah, but was anything like this really occurring? We have no record of it again. Okay. Now I want to just get right to the heart of the most theologically, morally problematic part of the plagues. And again, if we had all afternoon, I would point all this out. So just take my word for it. God tells Moses right up front, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart and he's not going to let the people go. And for the first 5 plagues, after each one, blood, frogs, lice, etc., The text tells us that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And he does not let the people go. And then after the sixth plague, there's a very subtle change in the text. And it moves from Pharaoh hardened his own heart to, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, this raises a very important moral question. And I'm just gonna share it to you with a very, very small sentence from the Midrash. Okay, this is from Midrash Rabbah, Shmot Rabbah. Ki ani hichbadati et libo, because I have hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is God talking to Moses. Now the rabbis. Amar Rav Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan says, Mikan, pitchon pela minim lomar. From here, or with this idea that God is doing the hardening, it enables a heretic or a cynic to say the following. Lo hayata mimenu sheya'asu tshuva. That he, meaning Pharaoh, was not allowed by God to do tshuva, to repent. So is this, to put it bluntly, is this really Pharaoh's fault if God's doing the hardening of his heart? Isn't Pharaoh at this point just an instrument of God's will? Just a puppet? And this is a very difficult moral conundrum. Why would God allow this kind of suffering just to make a point? And why would we vilify Pharaoh if Pharaoh has lost his free will? Why would we vilify anyone if they lack free will? And this is really, really, really difficult for the rabbis to resolve. Now, how do they resolve it? I'm gonna move quickly and oversimplify, but there are essentially two things here. One, well, I'm gonna suggest three. Two are the rabbis, one is mine. The first is the way the rabbis explain this is, look, here again, you're making the mistake of believing that earthly justice and cosmic justice are the same thing. That from an earthly perspective, from a human perspective, God is a bad actor here, setting Pharaoh up to fail and causing all this suffering and death among the Egyptians just to make his name great, God's name great, or to strike fear into the hearts of humanity, that this makes no earthly sense from a justice standpoint. And the rabbis say, well, no, it doesn't, but you're assuming that earthly justice and cosmic justice are the same, and they're not. They're entirely different. And God has God's reasons, and that's it. Now, the more nuanced explanation, which I prefer, although I don't think it's that much better, is that saying God hardened Pharaoh's heart is the Torah's way of saying that Pharaoh's behavior is irrational, unbelievable. And there is free will, but when the Torah takes it away, it's because the event is inexplicable. This must have been in God's hands, because if Pharaoh was any kind of normal human being, the first plague would have been enough. The second plague, the third plague, the fourth, enough that any normal human being would have acquiesced at this point And therefore, the Torah is saying God hardened Pharaoh's heart as this is the Torah's way of saying this is a supernatural event. That God gets credit for the supernatural events in the Torah, and human beings have free will for everything else. And this is in the category of supernatural, because no ordinary human would behave in this way, and that's what the Torah is telling us. This is God at work here. This is not Pharaoh. So those are sort of the two categories, and they're closely related, of explanation. And yeah, Sukasa, yeah, it applies to all this kind of evil. And I find it lacking. I think many do, but I think it's important that we understand it. Now, what do I think? What plague does this shift take place? It takes place after the 6th plague out of 10, which, if you think about it, is the tipping point, right? It's the last 9 holes. And the way I see this is that human beings have free will to a point. But there is often a point where our habits become our addiction, where we actually lose control. And the thing controls us more than we control the thing. Now, the thing in this case may have been Pharaoh's ego, or Pharaoh's disregard for the suffering of others, or his stubbornness. Call it what you want, but whatever it is in his personality that has caused him to say no the first 5 times on his own is now who he is. It now defines him. And that's how I see it, and I accept that's a very modern psychological point of view. But, okay. That's why Torah is so amazing, because we bring our own world to it, and it brings its world to us. In a minute, we'll go look at a couple of the actual plagues. But generally speaking, I think those are the 3 ways of looking at this moral conundrum of God pulling the strings at some point in this narrative. Any thoughts, comments, raised hands? I just want to look at everybody. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about just a couple. Susan, go ahead.
Yes, I think that's, where am I? That would be the explanation that I would certainly support. I mean, now later on, Maimonides writes about habits. And one of the things that he says is a repetition of habits, you get to a point of no return. And but he said, don't steal. I mean, the extension of that is don't steal a pencil the first time, the second time, then you go to something else. And he creates it himself. So
yeah, the Rambam, he talks about what we today call hedonic adaptation in his treatise on the problem of evil. And he said most of the evil in the world is the evil we do to ourselves, because we eat too much, we drink too much, we want too much. If we have copper, we want silver. If we have silver, we want gold. If we have gold, we want diamonds. And it's this hedonic adaptation. His worldview is that leads to nowhere good. And these minor moral transgressions lead nowhere good. The Talmud says that at first, I'm quoting now, sin starts out as thin as the strands of a spider web and end as thick as cart ropes. So yeah, step by step. And I'm going to ask, I hope you don't mind if I put you on the spot, Barney, but I'd like your perspective on this idea of this tipping point where one loses control from a psychological, psychiatric point of view. Are we on to something here?
Yes, I think so. And I think, as you are saying, there are numbers of ways to frame it. My way of framing things is through psychoanalysis, an old and getting older view of things. And yet at the same time, its oldness and seeming to disappear is predestined because it takes seriously, and this is going to be my point to you, it takes seriously the fact that most of the working of the mind is completely out of our awareness. When we say unconscious, we don't mean that it's not in our mind and then, oh, it came into my mind, so now it's not unconscious anymore. Unconscious has the meaning of a complete divorce from a possibility of a direct experience. So I think that in the story of the plagues, the most common term that most of us here today would be familiar with is narcissism. And we've read a lot about doubling down, right? That people double down when they are backed into a corner. And what is the problem when a person is backed into the corner that leads them to double down? I think the problem is the inability to stop and say, wait, maybe I'm wrong. Let me think in a larger way, because that means that there's something about us that is incomplete. So let me just wrap it up by saying, when God takes over hardening of Pharaoh's heart, this is the unconscious in a double bind. Mm-hmm. And the Pharaoh cannot back down. And now, if you will, it's out of his conscious control. I can stop there. And I think that gets the point across. I mean, as you can imagine, there's a whole lot more to say, but that gets to one way of looking at it.
We are subject to forces entirely beyond our control, right? Yeah.
If you've ever been hypnotized, that is proven to you directly. And it's one of the lessons that I give in teaching Freud at the very beginning. Is a story, which I'm not going to tell you, from when I was in a hypnosis show many years ago. And hypnosis requires that you give yourself over to it, right? So I was a good sport and said, all right, let's do this. And I did things that were impossible for me to do, physical things. And when you have that experience directly, or if you are given a post-hypnotic suggestion of you're going to open the window in 10 minutes after I wake you up and you can have no idea why, and it's absolutely the case, you have direct evidence of unconscious functioning. So there you go.
Wow. Yeah, that is extraordinarily interesting and helpful and consistent, right? With this admittedly modernist notion that there is a tipping point where we are subject to forces beyond our control. And maybe we always are. Maybe there's no tipping point. Maybe that's what it means to be human, which is even more interesting. Okay, so oh my goodness, it's 12:59 already. What happened?
Stay.
All right, so let me again. I just want to thank all of you. I love this, and we're going to do more of it in the year to come, and maybe we'll be able actually to be in Century City at some point in 2022 together again. But you know what? Because it's a new world, even if we do that, we're going to live stream at the same time because we're now in a parallel universe. And Wendy moved to Boston. So what are we going to do? We have to live stream.
I love Boston.
All right. Last thing, I mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to wish you a happy new year. And I do hope you'll read the Shabbat message that'll be out around 4:00 this afternoon, I think, to understand the context in which I mean that. And it's really from my heart to all of you. Let's hope for a new year with all that new means in a good way. And much love to all of you and your families. And I will see you in 2022.
safer than ever before. I love you,
you.
Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom, everybody. All
Shabbat
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, Rabbi.
right, Barney, thank you.
Shalom.
And I read your note.
Thank you.
Enjoy Massachusetts. I love the Bee Gees song about Massachusetts. Think I'm going back to Massachusetts. God bless you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, Miriam.